Late morning, Germany, 1943. Inside a guarded command center, maps cover the walls from floor to ceiling. Red and blue pins mark cities, factories, airfields. Phones ring, then fall silent. Officers wait, listening to reports that no longer sound like routine updates. High above the Reich, the sky has begun to change. Not a single raid, not scattered bombers, but formations, thick, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. American B-17s appear in numbers German air defenses were never designed to face. Long silver streams crossing borders in daylight, holding formation under fire, returning again and again. What had once been dismissed as an experiment now reveals itself as a system. Industrial, relentless, and expanding. For years, Adolf Hitler had believed Germany could absorb bombing, that its cities could endure, that the Luftwaffe would break any enemy in the air before damage became decisive. But the reports coming in now say something different. They describe skies filled with aircraft, fighter units burning fuel faster than it can be replaced, factories shaking under repeated blows. And in that moment, a realization begins to take shape, quiet, unwelcome, and irreversible. One that leads directly to how the war arrived at this point. When the war began in 1939, Germany believed it understood air power. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated its value early: Warsaw, Rotterdam, France. Air attacks were sharp, tactical, and closely tied to ground operations. Bombing in German doctrine was meant to open the way for armies, not to fight wars on its own. Cities were targets of opportunity, not primary objectives. This belief shaped everything that followed. By 1940 and 1941, Britain had already tried to break Germany from the air. The Royal Air Force bombed at night, striking industrial centers deep inside the Reich. But navigation was poor. Accuracy was limited. Losses were high. German leadership studied the results and drew a comfortable conclusion. Bombing was disruptive, but not decisive. Hitler absorbed this lesson fully. He believed Germany's industrial depth, dispersal, and discipline would allow it to endure any air campaign. Civilian morale, he argued, had survived worse in the First World War. The Reich's air defenses, radar belts, flak towers, night fighters, were expanding every month. There was no reason to believe an enemy could do more than harass. Then, America entered the war. After December 1941, German planners still saw the United States as an industrial giant, slow to mobilize and clumsy in execution. Distance, they assumed, would dilute American power. Training air crews took time. Building bombers took time. Shipping them across the Atlantic took even longer. In Berlin, this delay was mistaken for weakness. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that the United States did not intend to imitate Britain's approach. American air doctrine was built on a different premise: daylight bombing, flown-in tight formations aimed at specific industrial targets, defended not by darkness, but by mass. The decision was formalized in January 1943 at the Casablanca Conference. There, Allied leaders approved the combined bomber offensive. Britain would bomb by night. The Americans would bomb by day. Together, they would apply continuous pressure, 24 hours a day, against Germany's war economy. For Hitler, this distinction mattered little at first. Daylight bombing seemed reckless. Flying heavy bombers in clear skies, without escort fighters deep into Germany, appeared suicidal. Losses, German analysts predicted, would force the Americans to abandon the idea quickly. The Luftwaffe, still confident after years of dominance, expected decisive interceptions. But even as these assumptions hardened, changes were already underway. Across Britain, airfields filled with unfamiliar aircraft, 4-engine bombers larger than anything Germany fielded in numbers. Crews trained not for individual survival, but for formation discipline. Industrial targets were photographed, measured, and cataloged in detail. By late 1942, small American formations began probing German airspace. They were not yet overwhelming, but they were persistent. And with each mission, the gap between German expectations and American intent quietly narrowed, setting the stage for a confrontation Germany had not prepared to fight. By the start of 1943, the American air presence in Britain was no longer theoretical. It was visible, measurable, and accelerating. Airfields across East Anglia expanded almost overnight. Runways lengthened, hangars multiplied, villages filled with foreign uniforms and unfamiliar accents. The 8th Air Force, once a planning concept, now existed as an operational machine, fed by American industry and protected by Britain's geography. At the center of this force stood the B-17 Flying Fortress. Designed for altitude, endurance, and defense, the aircraft reflected American thinking about air war. Each bomber carried multiple heavy machine guns, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire when flown in formation. Survival was not individual, it was collective. Crews were trained to hold position under attack, even as aircraft around them burned or fell away. German analysts underestimated this discipline. Early interceptions inflicted losses, but not the collapse Berlin expected. Bombers absorbed punishment and continued to targets. Others turned back damaged, yet returned days later. Replacement aircraft arrived faster than German fighters could be built. What appeared costly was, in fact, sustainable. The targets themselves signaled American intent. Rather than area bombing, U.S. planners selected specific nodes of Germany's war economy. Aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, fuel production, transportation hubs. Each mission was logged, evaluated, and refined. When accuracy fell short, formations adjusted. When defenses stiffened, routes shifted. To German defenders, this method felt alien. The Luftwaffe had been built for short-range dominance, not prolonged attrition. Fighter units scrambled repeatedly in a single day, burning fuel reserves and wearing down pilots faster than replacements could be trained. Maintenance crews worked through the night, preparing aircraft already pushed beyond design limits. And still, the bombers came. Hitler's confidence in air defense began to erode not through catastrophe, but through accumulation. Loss reports grew steadily. Ammunition consumption outpaced forecasts. Radar stations tracked formations too large to engage cleanly. Flak units fired until barrels glowed, often with little effect at altitude. Yet, at the highest levels, belief persisted. American losses were highlighted. Mission failures were exaggerated. Goering assured the Führer that the Luftwaffe would adapt, that new tactics, heavier weapons, and aggressive interception would restore control of the skies. But beneath these assurances, German intelligence faced an uncomfortable reality. American production curves did not flatten. They climbed. Each month, more bombers appeared. Crews rotated in fresh, formations thickened. What had begun as raids now resembled scheduled industrial pressure, predictable in timing, relentless, with in execution. By mid-1943, the daylight sky over Germany had become a battlefield of endurance rather than surprise. And as American formations pressed deeper, the question inside German command circles shifted quietly, from whether the bombing could be stopped to how long Germany could withstand it. That question would soon be answered from multiple angles. Adolf Hitler did not react to the American bombers with immediate panic. He reacted with disbelief. For years, he had dismissed strategic bombing as a tool of weak nations. In his worldview, wars were decided by armies seizing ground and breaking enemies face to face. Air power was meant to support that struggle, not replace it. The idea that aircraft alone could dismantle an industrial state ran against everything he believed about strength and endurance. When reports of large American formations reached him, his first instinct was to reinterpret them. Loss figures were emphasized, failures were magnified, successes were explained away as temporary. If bombers were reaching targets, it was because commanders had not been aggressive enough, or because saboteurs had failed. Responsibility, in Hitler's system, rarely flowed upward. He demanded solutions that matched his expectations rather than reality. Fighters were ordered to engage regardless of loss. Flak was told to fire more, shoot higher, cover everything. New weapons were promised instant results. Each directive assumed that willpower could compensate for material imbalance. But belief has limits. As daylight raids multiplied, Hitler's language shifted subtly. Confidence gave way to irritation. Irritation hardened into suspicion. He spoke less about inevitability and more about betrayal, by industry, by commanders, by the Luftwaffe itself. The bombers were no longer an annoyance. They were a contradiction. And contradictions in Hitler's mind could only be resolved by force or by denial. That denial would shape every response that followed. The Luftwaffe entered 1943 already strained. Years of continuous combat had thinned its experienced pilots. Training programs shortened. Fuel allocations tightened. Aircraft designs prioritized speed and firepower over endurance. None of this mattered when fighting close to home or supporting ground campaigns. Against massed bombers, it became fatal. Intercepting B-17 formations demanded repeated climbs to high altitude, precise coordination, and sustained attacks through defensive fire. Fighters that survived the first pass often lacked fuel for a second. Pilots returned shaken. Aircraft riddled with damage. Losses were not just numerical. They were cumulative. Veteran pilots died faster than replacements could learn. New pilots entered combat with minimal hours, facing formations that punished inexperience instantly. Every engagement sharpened the imbalance. Goering promised solutions: heavy fighters, rockets, frontal attacks. Some worked briefly. None scaled fast enough. The Luftwaffe was bleeding skill, not machines, and once skill was gone, no factory could replace it. The B-17 was not invincible. It was methodical. Its true strength lay not in armor or guns alone, but in numbers and formation geometry. When dozens of bombers flew together, their defensive fire overlapped, creating zones of danger that German fighters had never encountered at this scale. Precision, often imperfect, was still sufficient when repeated. German defenses relied on disruption, breaking formations, isolating aircraft, but American crews trained relentlessly to hold position. Even damaged bombers stayed in formation when possible, absorbing punishment that would have shattered looser systems. Technology, in this contest, favored repetition over brilliance, and repetition was something Germany could not match. As these pressures mounted in the air, their effects spread outward, reaching factories, homes, and the streets below, where another side of the war was being lived daily. For much of the war, German civilians experienced conflict indirectly. Newsreels showed victories. Radios spoke of resilience. Air raids, when they came, were often at night, disorienting, frightening, but distant in cause and effect. Daylight bombing changed that relationship. American formations arrived under clear skies, visible for miles. The sound came first, a deep, continuous roar that did not fade quickly. People looked up and saw rows of aircraft crossing overhead, unhurried, unbroken. It was no longer possible to imagine the war as something happening elsewhere. Factories were struck while shifts were still working. Trains stopped mid-route. Streets emptied in seconds as sirens wailed. The daylight made destruction undeniable. Smoke rose while people watched. Shelters filled with a different kind of fear. Not the sudden shock of night raids, but the slow certainty that targets were being selected deliberately. Morale did not collapse immediately. Germans adapted, as populations always do, but confidence eroded. Each clear day carried tension. Each returning formation suggested endurance rather than desperation. The enemy was not improvising. He was planning. For the men inside the B-17s, daylight offered no concealment, only clarity. They saw the flak bursts rise toward them, black and precise. They watched fighters assemble in the distance, climbing patiently before diving into formation. Casualties were visible, not abstract. When a bomber fell, there was no ambiguity about what had happened. Loss rates were brutal. In 1943, a bomber crew's chances of completing a full tour were dangerously low. Crews knew the statistics. They flew anyway. Discipline held formations together where fear might have scattered them. Training emphasized procedure over instinct. Hold position, maintain speed. Cover the aircraft beside you. When bombers turned for home, damaged and leaking fuel, survival felt provisional rather than earned. Many returned to fly again days later. This persistence, more than any single mission, shaped German calculations. The Americans were absorbing losses that would have broken other air forces. American planners spoke of precision as a moral distinction. Factories, not cities. Industry, not civilians. In practice, war rarely respected such boundaries. Bombs missed, flak deflected aim. Industrial targets sat near homes and hospitals. Daylight made intentions visible, but it did not prevent suffering. Yet the moral calculation ran in both directions. German industry-powered weapons used across Europe. Disrupting it promised an earlier end to the war. This logic hardened with every mission. Once bombing reached scale, restraint became irrelevant. The system fed itself. Targets were selected not only for impact, but for pressure. The goal was no longer disruption, it was exhaustion. And exhaustion, in time, would force a decisive moment in the air war over Germany. That moment was approaching fast. By the summer of 1943, the Daylight Air War reached a point where theory could no longer hide reality. The targets now lay deep inside Germany's industrial core. Ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, aircraft factories at Regensburg, facilities so central to the war economy that their loss could ripple across every front. On August 17, 1943, the United States launched a mission unlike anything before it. Two large bomber forces took off from Britain, divided to confuse German defenses. One headed toward Regensburg, the other toward Schweinfurt. The plan was ambitious and dangerous. Strike both targets in a single day, then send one force onward to North Africa, stretching German interception beyond endurance. From the moment the formations crossed the coast, resistance was relentless. German fighters attacked repeatedly in waves. Head-on passes tore through formations. Flak filled the sky over targets with dense, coordinated fire. Bombers fell steadily, some exploding mid-air, others spiraling down in flames. Crews held formation as long as they could. Gaps opened, then closed. Damaged aircraft pressed on. Others turned back, unable to continue. The bombing itself was partially successful. Facilities were hit, production was disrupted, but the cost was severe. American losses shocked planners. Dozens of bombers failed to return. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured in a single day. The numbers could not be hidden, even from a leadership accustomed to sacrifice. In Germany, reactions were conflicted. On paper, the Luftwaffe claimed victory. Bombers had been destroyed in numbers. Goering presented the losses as proof that daylight bombing was unsustainable. Hitler seized on this interpretation eagerly. He declared that the Americans had overreached, that such attacks would bleed themselves dry. Yet behind these declarations, something had changed. The targets had been reached. Despite concentrated defenses, despite losses, American bombers had struck precisely what they were sent to destroy. Repairs would take time. Production would slow. More importantly, the concept had been proven. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids revealed a brutal truth for both sides. For the Americans, unescorted daylight bombing was too costly to continue unchanged. Loss rates approached unacceptable levels. Morale, while intact, showed strain. For Germany, victory in the air no longer meant preventing damage. It meant merely increasing the cost. And cost, when measured against American industry, favored the attacker. Within German command circles, quiet concern replaced celebration. Fighter units reported exhaustion. Ammunition stocks fell. Maintenance backlogs grew. Pilots spoke of endless engagements against formations that seemed to multiply rather than diminish. Hitler's response was characteristic. He demanded more aggression. He demanded new weapons. He demanded that the Luftwaffe do what it no longer could, destroy a system built on scale rather than surprise, but the system was already adapting. The Americans did not abandon daylight bombing. They paused, studied, and adjusted. Escort fighters would soon extend their reach, tactics would change, losses would fall. And when that happened, the balance in the skies over Germany would tip permanently. The turning point had not arrived in a single explosion, but in the realization that the next phase would be even harder to stop. The solution to the crisis revealed itself not in Germany, but in the skies over Britain. American planners had always understood the central weakness of daylight bombing, the absence of escort fighters deep inside enemy territory. Bombers could defend themselves for a time, but not indefinitely. The answer was not heavier armor or more guns. It was reach. By late 1943, that reach arrived. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, most decisively the P-51 Mustang, changed the air war in a way German command had not anticipated. Unlike earlier escorts, these fighters could accompany bombers from takeoff to target and back again. They did not turn away at the edge of Germany. They stayed. For the Luftwaffe, this was catastrophic. German fighters now faced a choice with no safe option: intercept the bombers and be attacked by escorts, engage the escorts, and leave bombers unchallenged. The sky, once structured around predictable engagements, became hostile everywhere. Losses accelerated. Experienced German pilots were hunted during climb and withdrawal, not just over targets. Airfields themselves came under attack. Training units were disrupted. Fuel shortages worsened as refineries were repeatedly struck. Hitler's reaction hardened into fixation. He ordered the defense of cities and factories at all costs. Fighters were tied to point defense, losing flexibility. New weapons, rockets, heavy cannons, were rushed into service, often before crews were fully trained. Promising jet designs were delayed by unrealistic demands and production constraints. None of it reversed the trend. By early 1944, American formations grew larger while German responses shrank. Flak still filled the air, but fighters arrived in fewer numbers and stayed for less time. Escort fighters roamed freely, attacking anything that flew or tried to. The strategic meaning of this shift was profound. Air superiority was no longer contested. It was being taken. With German skies increasingly open, bombing accuracy improved. Transportation networks were hit repeatedly. Aircraft production fell despite dispersal. Fuel shortages grounded fighters that still existed on paper. For Hitler, the contradiction became unavoidable. The Luftwaffe he had trusted to shield the Reich was being destroyed in the act of defending it. Each order to resist only accelerated the loss of what remained. The American bomber stream, once a test, had become a constant. And with air control slipping away, Germany's ability to maneuver, reinforce, or recover began to collapse across every front. The decisive moment had passed. What followed was not immediate defeat, but an unraveling whose consequences would be felt everywhere. The war was still being fought. Once air superiority tilted decisively, its effects moved rapidly from the sky to the ground. German industry did not collapse overnight. It strained, adapted, and endured. Factories were dispersed into forests, tunnels, and smaller workshops. Production schedules were reorganized. Civilian labor, foreign workers, and prisoners were pulled into longer shifts under worsening conditions. But endurance required fuel, and fuel was disappearing. Repeated attacks on synthetic fuel plants cut output month by month. Refineries that survived one raid were hit again before repairs could be completed. Rail lines delivering coal and raw materials were severed repeatedly. Even when factories remained intact, they stood idle for a lack of power or transport. The Luftwaffe felt this shortage first. Fighters sat grounded while bombers flew overhead unchallenged. Training hours were cut. Pilots entered combat with minimal preparation, if they entered it at all. Aircraft production figures, though impressive on paper, masked a growing hollowness. Machines existed without fuel. Crews existed without experience. Inside German command reports, the language shifted. Where once there had been confidence, there was now urgency. Requests for protection multiplied. Competing demands, cities, factories, transport hubs, overwhelmed available defenses. No prioritization could solve a shortage that was structural rather than tactical. Civilian life adjusted to permanent disruption. Transportation slowed to a crawl. Food distribution became uneven. Air raid alarms interrupted work daily. Shelters filled repeatedly, sometimes without incident, sometimes with devastating consequence. The psychological burden of daylight bombing accumulated quietly but relentlessly. And through it all, the bombing did not pause. American formations arrived with increasing regularity. Missions became routine rather than exceptional. The war economy was no longer responding to strikes. It was reacting to a sustained condition. For German planners, this was the most damaging realization of all. Bombing had ceased to be an event. It had become an environment. The longer it lasted, the less room remained for recovery. By late 1944, internal assessments acknowledged what public statements could not. Aircraft output declined despite increased effort. fuel reserves fell to critical levels. Transportation networks fractured beyond quick repair. Germany was still fighting, but it was fighting with diminishing means. And the full consequences of this imbalance were about to shape the final phase of the war in Europe. By early 1944, the strategic consequences of the air war were no longer confined to German factories or airfields. They reached every battlefield where Germany still struggled to hold ground. The most critical effect was invisible from the air: paralysis. With rail yards shattered and bridges repeatedly destroyed, German units found themselves unable to move when movement mattered most. Reinforcements arrived late, or not at all. Fuel shortages forced armored formations to ration training and delay redeployment. Commanders planned operations knowing that resupply could not be guaranteed. When Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, this imbalance became decisive. In the months before D-Day, bombing shifted toward transportation networks, airfields, and communications. German responses were limited, predictable, and increasingly ineffective. Fighters that remained were scattered, fuel-starved, and tied to defending individual points rather than contesting the skies as a whole. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German power, could no longer influence events at scale. Internal German reports reflected the change with unusual clarity. They spoke of critical shortages, irreversible losses, and operational immobility. These were not words of propaganda. They were admissions written for survival, not morale. Hitler, isolated from the front but inundated with reports, continued to demand resistance. New weapons were promised salvation. Counteroffensives were ordered without the means to support them. Each directive widened the gap between intention and capability. Meanwhile, Allied air power tightened its grip. Bombers flew with fewer losses. Escort fighters dominated airspace. German aircraft avoided combat whenever possible, preserving machines that could no longer be used effectively. Control of the air, once contested, was now assumed by the Allies. For Germany, defeat was no longer a question of battlefield skill alone. It was structural. The foundations of modern warfare, fuel, transport, communication, had been systematically eroded. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy, the outcome had already been shaped far above the beaches. The sky over Germany had decided the ground war that followed. And with that realization, the story moved beyond battles and statistics, toward what this moment revealed about power, leadership, and the nature of modern war itself. The American bomber streams over Germany did more than destroy factories and fuel plants. They exposed a truth about modern war that ideology could not override. Power was no longer measured only by territory held or armies fielded. It was measured by endurance, by the ability to replace losses faster than an enemy could inflict them, and to sustain pressure without pause. In that contest, belief mattered less than production and confidence less than logistics. For Adolf Hitler, the appearance of massed American B-17s represented a contradiction he never fully resolved. He had trusted will, command, and aggression to overcome material imbalance. When those tools failed, he demanded more of them, accelerating the collapse they were meant to prevent. The Luftwaffe's defeat in the air did not come from a single battle. It came from being forced into a role it was never designed to perform, defending an entire nation day after day against an opponent whose resources were effectively limitless. For the men in the bombers, the victory was not abstract. It was measured in survival, in empty bunks, in formations that returned thinner than they had departed. The cost was real, and it was paid continuously. For German civilians, the war became unavoidable. Daylight stripped away distance and illusion. The sky itself became a reminder that the conflict could no longer be managed, redirected, or postponed. In the end, the air war over Germany did not end the conflict on its own, but it reshaped everything that followed. It weakened resistance before armies advanced. It limited choices before decisions were made. It turned planning into reaction and confidence into improvisation. When the bombers passed overhead, they left behind more than smoke and rubble. They left a silence in which the outcome was no longer in doubt. And in that silence, the future of warfare revealed itself, relentless, industrial, and unforgiving to those who mistook belief for capacity. January 1944. Central Germany, snow clings to the fields below as contrails cut white scars across the winter sky. High above the cloud layer, hundreds of American bombers move in disciplined formation, engines steady, altitude unchanged. They do not scatter, they do not turn back. They press forward, even as black bursts of flak climb to meet them. On the ground, German air defense reports arrive in fragments. Fighter interceptions launched, ammunition expended, losses inflicted. Yet the formations remain intact. Damaged aircraft fall away, but most continue on course. Bomb bay doors open with mechanical calm. This was not how the war in the air was supposed to look. For years, German planners had believed no bomber force could survive sustained daylight attacks against the Reich. The theory was sound. Fighters would break formations. Flak would finish the rest. Morale would collapse long before industry did. But now, the evidence is unmistakable. The bombers keep coming, week after week, raid after raid, losses absorbed, replaced, and followed by more aircraft than before. Inside Germany's command structure, a quiet realization begins to take shape. The enemy's air power is not collapsing under counterattack. It is enduring and growing stronger through the punishment. And to understand how this moment became possible, the story must step back. Long before the bombers ever reached German skies, German expectations. Before the American Air War, when war began in Europe in September 1939, Germany possessed the most experienced and confident air force on the continent. The Luftwaffe had been built not merely as a supporting arm, but as a decisive instrument of modern war. Its early campaigns appeared to validate every assumption its planners had made. Over Poland, Luftwaffe aircraft shattered airfields, communications, and troop concentrations within days. In the West, during the spring of 1940, German air power helped paralyze French and British defenses with speed and coordination no opponent could counter. Even during the Battle of Britain, where Germany failed to achieve victory, the experience still reinforced core beliefs inside German air doctrine. Bombers, they concluded, were vulnerable. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm had proven capable of intercepting and destroying large numbers of enemy aircraft when conditions were right. British bomber losses during daylight raids in 1939 and 1940 were heavy enough that the Royal Air Force abandoned daylight bombing altogether. Night bombing became the only viable alternative. To German planners, this was not adaptation, it was confirmation. The conclusion hardened into doctrine. Sustained daylight bombing against a prepared air defense system was impossible. This belief was reinforced by Germany's own strategic culture. The Luftwaffe had never been designed as a long-range strategic bombing force. Its bombers were medium-range aircraft optimized for tactical strikes in support of ground operations. Precision attacks, rapid campaigns, and short wars were the assumption. Prolonged industrial attrition from the air was considered inefficient, even unrealistic. By 1941, German air defense planning rested on several pillars. Radar would provide early warning. Fighter control zones would guide interceptors directly to incoming formations. Heavy and light flak belts would force bombers to fly predictable routes and altitudes. Fighters would then exploit disrupted formations and deliver decisive losses. The system was not theoretical. It had been tested. It had worked. German intelligence assessments before America's entry into the war treated U.S. air power with skepticism. American aircraft production figures were noted, but often dismissed as exaggerated or irrelevant. Industrial capacity did not automatically translate into combat effectiveness. Training pilots took time. Combat experience could not be mass-produced. More importantly, German planners believed American doctrine itself was flawed. The U.S. Army Air Forces advocated daylight precision bombing, flying large bomber formations without fighter escort, relying on tight formations and defensive gunfire for protection. To German officers who had watched British bombers burn in daylight skies, the idea bordered on fantasy. Intercept calculations predicted unsustainable losses. Attrition rates exceeding 10% per mission were considered catastrophic. No air force, German planners believed, could endure that for long. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, confidence was quiet but firm. If the Americans attempted daylight bombing over Germany, they would learn the same lesson the British already had. The sky over the Reich would break them. And yet, by late 1942, that assumption would face its first serious test, not against theory, but against an enemy that fought the air war differently. With resources and intentions Germany had not fully grasped. The American approach to war in the air, when the United States entered the war in December 1941, it did not simply add another belligerent to the existing conflict. It introduced an entirely different scale of warfare, one shaped as much by factories and training fields as by tactics in the sky. American air doctrine had been formed years earlier, long before combat experience could test it. At its center was a belief that modern industrial war could be decided by striking an enemy's economic core: aircraft factories, oil refineries, transportation networks, power generation. The logic was straightforward: destroy the systems that sustained war, and armies would eventually be forced to stop fighting. This concept demanded daylight operations. Precision bombing aimed at specific industrial targets required visibility. Night bombing reduced accuracy and increased waste. American planners accepted higher risk in exchange for what they believed would be decisive results. To make that risk tolerable, the U.S. Army Air Forces placed extraordinary faith in formation defense. Bombers would fly in tightly organized combat boxes, overlapping fields of fire from dozens of heavy machine guns. An attacking fighter entering that defensive cone would face concentrated fire from multiple aircraft at once. The aircraft built to execute this doctrine reflected that belief. The B-17 Flying Fortress was heavily armored for its class. Fuel tanks were self-sealing. Critical systems were redundant. Most importantly, it carried defensive armament unmatched by any previous bomber. The aircraft was designed not for speed or stealth, but for endurance. Training mirrored the concept. Crews were drilled relentlessly in formation flying, gunnery coordination, damage control, and emergency procedures. Losses were expected. Replacement systems were planned accordingly. Unlike Germany, which relied on a relatively limited pool of highly experienced aircrew, the United States built a pipeline capable of producing tens of thousands of trained personnel annually. By mid-1942, the first American daylight raids over occupied Europe began. They were small at first: test operations, targets in France and the Low Countries. German defenses responded efficiently, but the results were unsettling. The bombers did not break. Losses were real, but not crippling. As raids extended deeper into Germany in 1943, German confidence remained intact. The Americans, they believed, were overreaching. Missions to Regensburg and Schweinfurt confirmed German expectations in the short term. U.S. losses were severe. Entire formations were mauled. Dozens of bombers were destroyed in single days. From the German perspective, the verdict seemed obvious. No air force could absorb such punishment indefinitely. What German planners underestimated was not American vulnerability, but American capacity for replacement and adaptation. Aircraft lost over Germany were already being replaced on factory lines operating around the clock. Crews lost in combat were being replaced by new graduates from training bases in Texas, Arizona, and California. Tactics evolved. Formations tightened. Defensive gunnery improved. Most critically, the Americans did not abandon daylight bombing after heavy losses. They adjusted and returned in greater numbers. By late 1943, German intelligence reports began to note an uncomfortable trend. Despite sustained counterattacks, American bomber strength over Germany was increasing, not declining. Losses inflicted were being absorbed rather than deterrent. The German system, built to shatter an enemy's will through attrition, was now facing an opponent whose strategy accepted attrition as a cost of victory. And as both sides pressed forward, the conflict in the air began to reveal its deeper dimensions: human, tactical, and strategic, that no pre-war doctrine had fully anticipated. Human, tactical, and technological realities in the sky. For the men who fought Germany's air war from the inside, theory quickly gave way to exhaustion. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, once accustomed to short-range interceptions and clear superiority, now faced a grinding routine of repeated engagements against formations that seemed to regenerate after every blow. Interceptions grew longer, more dangerous, and increasingly costly. A single American bomber formation could stretch for miles. Attacking it required precision, discipline, and courage. Fighters had to climb to altitude, fight through defensive fire, make a firing pass lasting only seconds, and then break away, often through a storm of machine gun bullets. Survival depended as much on luck as skill. German pilots adapted. Head-on attacks were developed to minimize exposure time. Heavy cannons were installed to destroy bombers with fewer hits. Specialized aircraft, such as heavily armed interceptors and rocket-equipped fighters, were introduced. Each innovation inflicted damage, but none solved the central problem. The bombers stayed together. American formation tactics turned individual aircraft into interdependent units. A damaged bomber rarely flew alone. Crews struggled to hold position, knowing separation meant destruction. Gunners fired not for individual kills, but to protect the integrity of the formation. This collective discipline reduced the effectiveness of German attacks and forced interceptors into predictable, dangerous approaches. Technology reinforced the pattern. The B-17's ability to absorb punishment became legendary not through myth, but through statistics. Aircraft returned with engines destroyed, control surfaces damaged, and fuselages torn open, yet remained flyable. Redundant systems allowed crews to compensate for failures that would have doomed earlier bombers. The ground German flak units performed with efficiency and professionalism. Heavy anti-aircraft guns forced bombers into tight altitude bands and disrupted formations. But flak alone rarely destroyed enough aircraft to stop a raid. It was a tool of harassment and attrition, not annihilation. The cumulative effect of these realities unsettled German command. Every successful interception came at a cost. Every lost pilot was irreplaceable in a system already strained by commitments on multiple fronts. Training hours declined as fuel shortages worsened. Experience, once the Luftwaffe's greatest advantage, began to erode. What had begun as a contest of tactics was becoming a contest of endurance, and Germany was not structured to win wars of attrition in the air. Yet the implications extended beyond pilots and machines. The pressure was now moving upward, into leadership decisions that would shape the air war's outcome far more decisively than any single engagement. Leadership, perception, and psychological strain. As losses mounted in the skies, the strain shifted from cockpit to command room. The Luftwaffe's leadership structure, once agile and confident, began to fracture under competing priorities, political pressure, and strategic confusion. At the center of this tension stood Adolf Hitler, whose views on air power were shaped less by technical realities than by expectation and control. Hitler had long believed that air defense of the Reich was both achievable and decisive. He expected technological solutions, new weapons, heavier guns, faster fighters, to restore dominance. When these measures failed to halt American bomber formations, frustration replaced confidence. Orders multiplied, requirements conflicted. The demand for immediate results grew sharper, even as resources diminished. Luftwaffe commanders found themselves trapped between operational reality and political expectation. Requests for strategic flexibility were overridden by directives that prioritized symbolic defense over sustainable effectiveness. Fighters were ordered to protect cities at all costs, even when doing so depleted forces needed elsewhere. Production was redirected toward experimental weapons that arrived too late or in insufficient numbers to matter. German intelligence assessments compounded the problem. Reports continued to underestimate American production capacity and overestimate the long-term impact of bomber losses. Each raid destroyed aircraft, but each subsequent raid appeared larger than the last. The conclusion was unsettling. Destruction was no longer cumulative. It was being outpaced. Within German society, the psychological impact grew unavoidable. Air raid sirens became routine. Industrial workers labored under constant threat. Confidence in air defense, once a point of national pride, quietly eroded. The promise that the Luftwaffe would shield the homeland no longer matched lived experience. Morale inside the air defense system followed the same arc. Flak crews and pilots fought with discipline, but with diminishing belief that victory lay ahead. Success was measured in aircraft destroyed, not raids stopped. The strategic initiative had shifted, even if German leadership had not yet fully acknowledged it. By late 1943, the air war had ceased to be a question of tactics or courage. It had become a question of inevitability. The American bomber force was not being broken by counterattack. It was surviving, adapting, and expanding. And soon, a series of operations would remove any remaining ambiguity, forcing German leadership to confront a turning point that could no longer be managed through orders or innovation alone when attrition failed to break American air power. February 1944 marked the moment when uncertainty gave way to clarity. For months, German air defenses had inflicted steady losses on American bomber formations. Pilots were exhausted. Aircraft were destroyed in large numbers. On paper, the system was working. Then came the sustained offensives, later known as Big Week. Beginning on February 20, 1944, the United States Army Air Forces launched a coordinated series of massive daylight raids against German aircraft production facilities, airfields, and infrastructure. The objective was no longer limited to destroying factories. It was to force the Luftwaffe into the air and destroy it there. From the German perspective, this was the confrontation they had prepared for. Fighters rose in waves to intercept. Flak belts engaged with intensity unmatched earlier in the war. Every available measure was applied. But something fundamental had changed. American bombers now arrived with long-range fighter escort. P-47s, or P-47s, and P-38s pushed deeper than before, and newly introduced P-51 Mustangs stayed with the bombers all the way to their targets and back. German fighters could no longer choose when and where to attack. Every interception now carried the risk of immediate engagement by escort fighters with speed, altitude advantage, and fuel to remain in the fight. Loss ratios shifted with brutal clarity. During Big Week, German fighter losses exceeded those of the Americans in proportions that could not be sustained. Experienced pilots were killed or wounded faster than they could be replaced. Aircraft production, the very industry the Luftwaffe depended upon for recovery, was being systematically attacked at the same time. Inside German command channels, reports became increasingly stark. Interceptions were still possible, but increasingly costly. Fighter units returned with fewer aircraft than they launched. Squadrons that had once been elite were now composites of instructors, veterans, and barely trained replacements. Hitler demanded intensified defense. New weapons were accelerated. Orders emphasized resistance without retreat. Yet even as directives hardened, the physical reality worsened. Fuel shortages limited training. Pilots entered combat with fewer flight hours than their predecessors. Mechanical failures increased as maintenance crews struggled to keep aircraft operational under bombing pressure. The Americans, meanwhile, pressed forward with grim consistency. Losses were acknowledged, analyzed, and absorbed. Bombers returned damaged, but factories replaced them. Crews were lost, but training pipelines continued to deliver new ones. The rhythm of operations did not slow. By early March 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. German counterattacks were no longer reducing American air power. They were accelerating the depletion of Germany's own. And with each passing raid, the air over the Reich became less contested, not because the Americans were unchallenged, but because the defenders were being consumed faster than they could recover. The realization was spreading upward through the German command structure toward a point where denial would no longer be possible. The point of no recovery. By the spring of 1944, the German air defense system was still fighting, but it was no longer controlling events. Each American raid now forced a decision the Luftwaffe could not avoid: intercept and lose irreplaceable pilots, or stand down and concede the skies. Neither option offered recovery. The introduction of full-range fighter escort changed the geometry of the air war completely. German interceptors were now engaged before they reached bomber formations, during their attacks, and again as they attempted to disengage. Attrition occurred not in isolated clashes, but continuously, from climb-out to landing. Jet aircraft promised salvation, but delivered none. The Me-262 entered service too late and in too few numbers. Its deployment was fragmented by competing demands: interceptor, bomber, reconnaissance, none of which allowed it to function as a decisive force. Fuel shortages grounded many jets before they ever reached combat altitude. Pilots trained on piston-engine fighters struggled to adapt under combat conditions. Flak defenses intensified, but flak could not chase bombers away from targets. It could damage. It could disrupt. But it could not regain air superiority. Meanwhile, American bombing was now directly targeting fuel production. Synthetic oil plants, critical to every German aircraft, were hit repeatedly. Each successful raid reduced sortie rates further. Inside the Reich, the consequences compounded. Factories dispersed, slowing production, transportation networks broke down, replacement aircraft arrived without fuel, replacement pilots arrived without experience. The Luftwaffe was becoming a hollow force, present on paper, exhausted in reality. Hitler continued to demand resistance. Orders emphasized holding territory, defending cities, preventing psychological collapse. But the logic of air warfare was indifferent to orders. Control of the sky depended on sustainable strength, not determination. By June 1944, the outcome was irreversible. When Allied forces landed in Normandy, German air opposition was minimal. The Luftwaffe had not been destroyed in a single battle. It had been worn down in hundreds of engagements it could not afford. American air power had survived every German counterattack not by avoiding losses, but by enduring them better than its enemy. The air war had reached its decision point, not in a moment of dramatic collapse, but in the quiet absence of German aircraft over the battlefield. And as the skies cleared for Allied armies below, the consequences of that survival would now unfold on the ground, across an entire continent. The strategic consequences of air superiority. With German air power unable to contest the skies in meaningful strength, the character of the war in Europe changed permanently. The absence was as decisive as any battlefield victory. Allied aircraft now operated with freedom that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. In the weeks following the Normandy landings, American and Allied air forces dominated roads, railways, bridges, and troop concentrations. German units moving toward the front did so at night in fragments under constant threat. Supplies arrived late or not at all. Commanders lost the ability to maneuver forces at scale. This paralysis was not sudden. It was the accumulated result of months of attrition in the air. The Luftwaffe still existed, but it no longer functioned as a coherent defensive system. Fighter units were scattered, under strength, and short of fuel. Many aircraft were grounded not by enemy action, but by logistical collapse. Industrial damage deepened the problem. American bombing did not destroy German production outright, but it disrupted it repeatedly and predictably. Factories relocated, output fluctuated, transportation bottlenecks delayed delivery. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines only to sit idle, lacking fuel or trained pilots. German reports acknowledged the imbalance. Fighter commanders noted that new pilots often entered combat with minimal operational training. Veterans were exhausted, rotated too infrequently, and burdened with leadership roles that removed them from flying. The experience gap widened with each month. For the civilian population, the effects were constant and cumulative. Air raids destroyed housing, infrastructure, and morale. The promise that the Reich could be defended from the air had proven false. Sirens became routine. Shelters became permanent fixtures of daily life. Confidence in eventual victory weakened quietly but steadily. Inside the German leadership, explanations shifted. Failure was blamed on shortages, on subordinates, on circumstances beyond control. But the central reality remained unchanged. The Luftwaffe could no longer prevent American bombers from reaching their targets in force. American air power, by contrast, expanded its role. Tactical support, interdiction, and strategic bombing merged into a single continuous pressure. Aircraft operated across all altitudes and missions, shaping the battlefield before ground forces arrived and sustaining advantage afterward. What had begun as an effort to destroy German industry had evolved into something broader: the systematic removal of Germany's ability to resist effectively. And as the Reich struggled to respond, the final consequences of air superiority were still unfolding. Recognition, reckoning, and the end of illusion. By late 1944, The air war over Germany no longer resembled a contest between equals. It had become an asymmetrical struggle, one side capable of sustained pressure, the other struggling simply to respond. The Luftwaffe's remaining strength was fragmented, reactive, and increasingly symbolic. German internal assessments grew more candid as the situation deteriorated. Reports from regional air defense commands acknowledged that interception rates were falling, not because of tactical failure, but because aircraft were unavailable. Fuel allocations were reduced to emergency levels. Training flights were curtailed. New pilots entered combat with barely enough hours to fly formation, let alone survive complex engagements. American bombing now focused relentlessly on oil production and transportation networks. Synthetic fuel plants were hit again and again, often repaired just enough to resume operation before the next raid arrived. Each strike compounded the shortage. Aircraft that could still fly were grounded for lack of fuel. Units that still existed on paper could not be assembled in the air. The psychological effect was equally decisive. German commanders no longer spoke of defeating American air power, only of limiting damage. Success was redefined downward. A raid partially disrupted became a victory. A factory damaged but not destroyed was considered acceptable. The language of inevitability had entered official thinking. Hitler's expectations did not change easily. He continued to demand resistance, emphasizing willpower and technological salvation. But even within the highest levels of command, belief in a decisive air defense had evaporated. The gap between orders and reality widened until compliance itself became impossible. For American planners, the outcome validated their central assumption. Control of the air was not achieved through a single decisive battle, but through sustained pressure that the enemy could not match. Losses were real. Crews died. Aircraft fell. But the structure supporting the force endured, and that endurance proved decisive. By early 1945, American bombers operated over Germany with minimal interference. Escort fighters ranged freely. Ground attack aircraft struck targets of opportunity. The Luftwaffe's presence was reduced to isolated engagements, brave but strategically irrelevant. The German air defense system had not been defeated by a single weapon or tactic. It had been worn down by an enemy that survived every counterattack and returned stronger each time. And in that survival lay the war's final lesson, one that extended far beyond the ruins of German cities and factories. What survival in the air revealed about modern war, the air war over Germany did not end with a dramatic collapse or a final decisive engagement. It ended quietly, in the absence of opposition. The skies, once fiercely contested, became open pathways for aircraft that no longer needed to fight their way through. This outcome was not a failure of German courage or effort. Luftwaffe pilots and air defense crews fought with discipline and persistence under conditions that grew steadily worse. Their defeat came from structure, not spirit, from a system unable to sustain prolonged attrition against an opponent built for endurance. American air power did not survive German counterattacks because it was invulnerable. Bombers were destroyed. Crews were lost. Entire formations were shattered on certain days, but survival was measured over months and years, not missions. What mattered was not avoiding losses, but replacing them faster than the enemy could impose them. The war revealed a fundamental truth about industrial conflict. Victory belonged to the side that could absorb damage, adapt doctrine, and continue operating at scale. Tactical brilliance and technological innovation mattered, but only when supported by training pipelines, logistics, fuel, and production that could not be easily disrupted. For Germany, the realization came too late. By the time it was clear that American air power could not be broken from the sky, the resources needed to change the outcome were already gone. Air superiority had been decided not by a single battle, but by the accumulation of irreversible choices. For history, the lesson endures. Control of the air is not about dominance in any one moment. It is about survival across time, about the ability to return after loss, to learn under fire, and to continue pressing forward when theory fails. In the end, American air power did not win, because it never faltered. It won, because under relentless attack it endured, and in doing so reshaped the nature of modern warfare forever.